The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his holy word.
Amen. You may be seated. Let us be in a spirit of prayer. Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable unto you. And may we, like Samuel, call out and say, "Speak, Lord, for we are listening." Amen. In the process of getting to know me, I think you know that my husband Jim has been a police officer for a number of years. And one thing that Jim told me was that if you drive a red car, you're more likely to be stopped for speeding. Do any of you drive red cars? Have you ever experienced that? Yeah, you must be good drivers. But apparently, when you drive a red car, sometimes you go faster. Apparently, people who want to go faster maybe drive red cars. And I've never had that experience because I haven't had a red car. But some people do. And Jim has borne this out. The other thing that I've never done is I've never walked around with brown or black skin. So I don't know what that feels like. But I know that I have friends who are moms of boys with black skin who have to teach their children to be careful because they are more likely to be stopped for criminal activity. These moms tell their boys not to wear their hoodies up on their heads. These moms tell their boys not to have their hands in their pockets. They are expected to exceed even the standards that we set for our very good children. They have to act better than good so that they won't be stopped. And the reason I'm talking about this today is because our neighbors are these people who have different color skin, just like the Samaritan. Our neighbors are these people who are being shot and killed by police officers. Now, Jim and I, you may imagine, have some great conversations in our household between a pastor and a police officer about social justice, about justice in the name of the law. And so I fully understand that there are two sides to all of these conversations. In fact, as the young bride of a police officer, when I was 18 years old, we got married. And one of the first things, we got married in November. So the following, no we didn't, we got married in July. Look at me. My birthday's in November. Josh's birthday's in November. Okay, sorry about that. Our anniversary is tomorrow. We will be married 34 years. See, Jim, I do know that. And I'm not blushing, I'm really not. So we were married in July. So it must have been the following year that Jim was, or maybe it was while we were still dating, that we were, Jim was getting ready as a Loudon, New Hampshire police officer. He worked in Laconia during Bike Week. And me, as a very young bride, had no idea what to expect. He was sharing things with me about this. And he knows now there are things that he should not share with me, and this is probably one of them. He did tell me that the Lakeside Sharks of Laconia, a motorcycle gang in Laconia, wanted to join with the Hells Angels, the motorcycle gang that we've all heard of from the movies. And in order to do that, their initiation rite was to kill a police officer. And here I was, a young bride, a child, 18 years old, sending my husband off to work in the midst of this dangerous situation. I stayed that night at my dad's house, and I can remember just being sick all night long. Didn't sleep a wink. I was so scared. And it breaks my heart to think that there are 5 families in Dallas whose police officer didn't come home this week, whose worst nightmares had come true. And so this is to say that I understand deeply the pain these people must feel. But I also understand deeply that racism in our society is leading to some of the dissension that is creating these kinds of tumultuous experiences. And that we as Christians, that we as church members, members are called to do something about it. In our vows of baptism, we are called to fight against injustice and oppression of every kind. And I know that here in New Hampshire, we are far away from Dallas, and we are far away from the other places where these incidents have taken place lately. But there are things we can do. We are called as resurrection people to transform the world. We are called to be people of peace. We are called to be people of prayer. And there is something we can do. But the thing is that as much as I was afraid that night, sending Jim off to that motorcycle week where they had promised to kill a cop, as much as I was afraid then, all of us are afraid at one time or another. It's the way we survive. It's the very most basic human need is to ensure our own survival. And so when we perceive someone as a threat, we're careful. And I can imagine that the police officers in these situations where the black men were killed, that they were trying to be careful. In some instances, and in some instances things were taken far too far. People didn't deserve to die for a taillight being out. But I do understand what it's like to be afraid when you're walking down the street late at night and you see someone. If you see a person perhaps who has a button-down Oxford shirt on, you think maybe this is a lawyer, maybe this is a doctor, maybe this is someone who is trustworthy. But if you see someone who's coming toward you who looks very different than you may be afraid. Someone with a hoodie pulled over their head or their hands in their pockets. You may clutch your purse closer to yourself. You may hold your child closer. Jim and I were talking about this morning, and we were thinking about some other examples. We happen to ride motorcycles. If you see us in our black leather vests with all our tattoos, you may think something of us. You may think something else of us when we show up in a police uniform or in a clergy collar. And so I understand that it's a human instinct to be afraid. But Jesus tells us over and over and over and over again not to be afraid, to trust God, to love our neighbor. And so as hard as that is, even in those moments when we are fearful, I would remind you that that is your Christian duty, to not be afraid, to be loving to your neighbor. The lawyer in our story today, this parable that Jesus told, asked, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus asked, "What is in the law?" The lawyer responded, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And then he asked, "Who is my neighbor?" Who is your neighbor? Is your neighbor the person who just lives next door to you? I think it's more than that, because this story is so shocking that this Samaritan acted so differently. I think it's the person who's different than you, the person who you expect is going to hurt you. I think that's the neighbor that Jesus is calling us to love. That's the neighbor that Jesus is calling us to be in relationship with, to understand. If we imagine a little child that we've invited to our home, and we've baked some cookies, and we've set out some nice toys, and this child comes to our door, and oh my goodness, it almost looks like you did when you were a child. If you held a photograph of yourself as a child against this child at your door, you have the same complexion, the same shape of nose, the same texture of hair. And so you feel an affinity toward that child. And that child is well-dressed and well-behaved. And so you want to invite that child into your home. Here, have some of these cookies and play with these toys. But then if you think again and you think of a child whose skin color is different than yours, or whose nose is a different shape, or whose hair is a different texture, whose clothes are bedraggled and dirty and torn. Maybe their nose is running. And you're not as inclined to offer them the cookies and the toys, because the toys will get dirty, and then who can play with them? And you're not sure you want to get sick. Maybe they have a cold or something. And you're standoffish, you back off. But think about the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan stopped to help this man in the ditch who was beaten up and injured by these robbers. That was the person in need. This child is the person who needs your love, who needs the love expressed in those cookies, and the respite expressed in the toys from what might be a terribly difficult life. This is the child that needs your help. This is your neighbor. This is who God calls you into relationship with. This is who God loves as God's precious child. You know, we're a society of joiners. We love to be a part of something, a part of the in crowd, right? Back in the 50s and 60s, people were joining churches like crazy. And people were joining organizations too. Organizations that had the same ideals that they had, or wanted to do the same service that they did. People like the Masons and the Elks and the VFW, people who had things in common, would come together to be in relationship with one another and to do good in the world together. The problem sometimes, though, becomes when it's us versus them, us inside the club versus those outside the club. So in the 80s, when we were wearing members' jackets to denote that we were part of the club, what were we saying to the people who were outside? And that's what Jesus is calling us to do too, is to break down those walls, to break down those barriers, to reach out to those people outside in the world and include them, to love them as our neighbors. And this goes back way before the 50s or the 80s. It goes way back. Paul said in Galatians that neither Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free nor men nor women, he was talking about breaking down those barriers. Not making distinctions between us and them, but including people, loving people, especially the people like the man in the ditch who need us the most. When I was in Concord, New Hampshire, I think it was after I received my call to ministry, but before I had begun school, I was a part of an organization called the Concord Charitable Female Society. Concord Charitable Female Society. And it was begun by the wife of a Baptist minister in town. And the aim was to have milk delivered to moms and kids in need. Okay? So this was back when there was a milkman, a delivery man that would come around. And these women would do projects to earn money, to pay for milk to be delivered to the orphans and the moms in town that needed it. And it evolved over the course of time to an organization where we collected those funds, and we also helped people with rent, with car repairs, with dental appointments, all sorts of things. And then each Thanksgiving and Christmas we would bring baskets, and we would actually for the first time have contact with these families, because for most of the year it was anonymous. We didn't know who needed help, and they didn't know who they were receiving it from. They only knew the milkman who gave her out. But on Thanksgiving and Christmas we got specific information about the families. We got the sizes of clothing that the children wore, their preference for toys, their ages, their genders, that sort of thing, so that we could give them toys that were appropriate. And we were sent out in teams of 2 to their homes. And we got to meet them. And it was pretty precious. Because all of the things that we do in the Christian church to help other people, when we obey Matthew 25 that says to feed the poor, to heal the sick, it's all good to send money to causes, and we should do that. But also, we should be building relationship, loving our neighbor, up close and personal, not from a distance. So we had heard in the course of doing our work that there was a family from Rwanda that had needed our help. And we learned of a 7-year-old boy who needed significant dental work done. And we heard his story, his devastating story. In Rwanda, where the genocides were going on, this boy had witnessed his uncle being killed right in front of him. And so we knew a little bit about a family from Rwanda that was in our community. There were a lot of refugees in Concord at the time. But over the course of time, my son, who happened to be 7 at the time as well, came home and started talking about his friend Daniel. Daniel. And my friends at the Concord Female Charitable Society told me on Thanksgiving about this family that they went into their home, and they brought cans of food, and the family from Rwanda was very gracious. Thank you so much for the food. but they weren't sure what to do with it. When you don't read English, and you don't have a can opener, this doesn't look like food as much as it looks like a paperweight, right? But when they handed the family the basket of fresh produce, when they handed them sweet potatoes, the two boys, the 7-year-old boy and his little brother, danced around the room. They knew what this was. This was food. This was something they could eat. And they danced around and around and around in circles. And then I had another experience with my son and Daniel, and oh my gosh, this is the same family. And I began to understand who this family was, and we began to be in a relationship with this family, mostly because of my son just reaching out. And he had a younger brother named Moses. My brother's name is Japheth, which is Noah's son's name. My son's name is Joshua, and you know Joshua in the Bible, right? And then there's Daniel, and then there's Moses. There was one day I had them all in the back seat, and we were going to the park together. It was truly biblical. It was a fun time. But back to the story. These children, these people, we had given to them. We had helped them. It was an unlikely situation that we would get to know them in so many ways in our lives, but we did. And it wasn't just a handout. It was developing relationships with them. God calls us to love our neighbor, the person who's different from us. My child never had to witness an uncle killed in a genocide. These people were very different than me. But these were our neighbors. These were the people we were called to love, and I am so grateful for that opportunity. I'm still Facebook friends with Daniel. I get to see his graduation pictures this year. It was pretty precious. We are resurrection people. And we know what the resurrection means when we're at Easter time, but we're resurrection people. We are people called to new life, to new relationship, to transformation in this world. We are called to live out our vows in baptism and confirmation when we were asked, do you accept the freedom and power God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? We all said yes. We all said yes. And here we are, like Esther, for such a time as this. We have this opportunity. We have this time with all this strife, with all this violence, when we can be the bringers of peace. God grant us the strength and the love and the ability to do just that. Amen. Our hymn of response is the summons. It's on page 2130 in the small faithfully sing hymnal, but also here on the wall.